I want to start with a couple of disclaimers. One, if you're someone who is convinced that vaccines cause autism and that all of the research to the contrary is a deep state cover up, then this probably isn't for you. I don't think that there's anything I can say to bring you around to this side of things, and that's fine. But if you're a well meaning person who's trying to grapple with a statistic that seems really scary and you maybe have gotten a little off course along the way, then this is for you. Two, this is not me, a low support needs autistic person, saying, but I can do all the things RFK said autistic people can't do, so I'm valid, because that's not the point that I'm trying to make, and because that's not a belief that I hold. I think that tying anyone's humanity to their productivity or their contribution to the system is a really evil and dangerous thing to do. I also don't want to talk over higher support needs people or their loved ones, because that's who's going to be most immediately and most directly impacted by whatever policies are going to come from this. This is, however, me, an autistic person, just trying to speak to people for a moment. I think that for some people, it takes hearing it from someone you know, and I'm guessing that if you're seeing this, you know me. I can be a face that maybe humanizes autism a little bit for you, because I'm not some caricature of a life-ruining, family-destroying disease. I'm just Caitlin. You watched me grow up, or I sat next to you in church, or we survived high school together or something. And even if you don't know me specifically, you know an autistic person, I guarantee it. And I just think that some of you need to be reminded of that. Let's talk about me for a second. Who do I think I am to publicly disprove information being put out by the Department of Health and Human Services? Well, I research autism professionally. I go through peer-reviewed studies and I write articles about autism that are meant to be meticulously fact-checked and easily digestible to people who don't research autism for a living. I send those articles to a medical reviewer who makes sure that all of my information is sound and supported, and then they send those articles to a mental health practice who approves them and publishes them. I also help facilitate a virtual social and peer support group for autistic adults. There are nearly 2,000 of us. And all of that to say, I spend a lot of time talking about autism and doing so in a way that's researched and nuanced. I'm also autistic, so I do have a bit of an inside peek into what the hell's going on here. With all of that out of the way, let's get into it. I want to talk about the memo released by RFK Jr. and the HHS and the press conference that accompanied it. I think maybe we just kind of go through it together and I can debunk some misinformation as we go, because make no mistake, that's what this is. It's flagrant misinformation that is being used to push eugenics. Eugenics? What's that? We'll get to it. The crux of the article seems to really be that autism is on the rise. Is that true? Not exactly. Autism diagnosis rates are on the rise, yes, but those are two different phenomena. And let's look at why autism rates are higher. And just as an aside, I will find a way to link the sources that I'm using. Start with how autism as a diagnosis has changed over the years. Autism was first described in 1943, and it was described as an extreme loneliness and an intense preference for sameness. Then, in 1968, the DSM-2 defined autism as a form of childhood schizophrenia marked by a detachment from reality. As a note, the DSM is the diagnostic manual that defines different mental health or developmental conditions and the criteria that must be met to diagnose those. The number after DSM just notates which version of the manual we're talking about. So for reference, we use the DSM-5 now. In 1980, the DSM-3 first established autism as its own developmental condition separate from schizophrenia. There were 3 specific diagnostic criteria, all of which must have manifested in the first 30 months of life. And those were a lack of interest in people, severe impairments in communication, and bizarre responses to the environment. The diagnostic manual was amended in 1987 to eliminate the requirement that all symptoms appear in the first 30 months, and it allowed for milder forms of autism to be diagnosed. However, those were considered a separate condition known as pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. And the word spectrum wasn't being used yet, but the expanded criteria was beginning to represent the various autistic presentations. The DSM-4, released in 1997 and revised in 2000, was the first edition to define autism as a spectrum. The spectrum included Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, which was marked by severe developmental regressions, and Rett syndrome, which was used to explain differences in movement and communication in girls specifically. And we'll talk more about Asperger's syndrome later when we circle back to eugenics. Throughout the 2000s, our understanding of autism was constantly changing. There was initially a large focus on finding causes and cures for autism and its related conditions. We've already gone on this goose chase. However, we could not find an environmental cause for autism, and we did not find a cure. What we did find, however, is that autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that is present at birth. Present at birth. Every time. Sure, autistic traits aren't apparent at birth, but every single autistic person was born autistic. Ultimately, experts realized that the cause and cure approach wasn't feasible, and they came to define autism as an encompassing diagnosis ranging from mild to severe. In 2013, the DSM-5, the current version, was published, and our current criteria for diagnosing autism was introduced. And the label autism spectrum disorder was born. So what does all of this mean? Put simply, it means that before 1980, no one was being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as it exists today. Autistic traits certainly existed, but there was no freestanding and all-encompassing diagnosis to explain them. Further, early forms of the diagnostic criteria excluded much of the autism spectrum, dismissing both mild and severe cases as separate conditions. The definition of autism spectrum disorder has only recently been expanded to include those cases. This means that people are being diagnosed now who in the past would have been diagnosed with other, less accurate conditions. Credible research tends to agree that, yes, there are more diagnosed autistic people in the world now than in the past. Diagnosed is the key word, though. Current trends in autism diagnoses just reflect our deeper and more inclusive understanding of autism rather than a true dramatic increase in the number of autistic people. The fact of the matter is that RFK is wrong. The scientific consensus is that autism is a genetic condition that is present at birth. The proposed causes of autism that RFK wants to explore include vaccines, ultrasounds, food additives, and other things. But we have already ruled those things out. We already know the answer. The main point that Kennedy keeps hitting that is that we have to look at the link between vaccines and autism. And he is far from the first person to parrot this talking point. So let's break all of that down. The anti-vaccine thing really comes from one study. In 1998, Andrew Wakefield and his colleagues published a paper in the journal The Lancet. Wakefield's hypothesis was that the measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR vaccine, caused a series of events that included intestinal inflammation, entrance into the bloodstream of proteins harmful to the brain, and the consequent development of autism. In support of his hypothesis, Wakefield described 12 children with developmental delays. 8 of those children had autism. All of the children had intestinal complaints and developed autism within 1 month of receiving the MMR vaccine. The Wakefield paper was published in 1998, and it was flawed for 2 big reasons. One, about 90% of the children in England, where the study took place, received the MMR vaccine at the time the paper was written. Because MMR is administered at a time when many children are diagnosed with autism anyway, it would be expected that most children with autism have received an MMR vaccine and that many of them have received it kind of recently. The observation that some children with autism received MMR recently is expected. However, the determination of whether MMR causes autism is best made by studying the incidence of autism in vaccinated and unvaccinated children. This wasn't done. There was no control group in the study. Although the authors claim that autism was a consequence of the intestinal inflammation, the intestinal symptoms were observed after, not before, the symptoms of autism in all 8 cases of autistic children. The study was retracted, which in scientific terms means that the paper is not part of the scientific record because it was found to be based on misconduct. In this case, the studies were deemed fraudulent and the data was misrepresented. So did Andrew Wakefield prove that vaccines cause autism? The answer is an unequivocal no. His scientifically unsound study accomplished only 2 things: irreparably damaging public trust in preventative medicine and losing him his license to practice medicine. Prior to and since that study, dozens of peer-reviewed long-range studies have been unable to find a link between vaccines and autism, because there isn't one. Point blank period, there is no truth to the conspiracy that vaccines and autism are related. But let's assume for a second that there is a link. Let's pretend that you're right, which, again, you aren't. But let's pretend that a vaccination against measles marginally increased your child's chances of being autistic. Would you prefer an autistic child or a dead one? Because that is ultimately the point that you're arguing, right? That you would prefer your child die of a preventable disease than be alive and autistic. Those of you out there who boldly brand yourselves as activists for your child's well-being, is that not what you're advocating for? Your right to watch your child die of a preventable disease instead of watching your child live into adulthood as an autistic person? Make no mistake, autism does not destroy families. Death does. But there isn't a link. So you're taking the gamble for nothing. Did a handful of autistic people receive childhood vaccines? Sure. Did most of our moms have ultrasounds? Of course. And have most of us crushed a bag of hot Cheetos during a binge watch? Yeah, absolutely. But those things are true of almost everyone. So why is the autism rate only 1 in 33 children and 1 in 45 adults? Everyone I know is a fully vaxxed person whose mom had appropriate prenatal care and who enjoys Doritos on occasion. So why am I autistic and they're not? Because I was born autistic and they were not. However, all of this aside, it's worth noting that even with the rate of diagnosis on the rise, the rate of autism in the population is still only around 2%. Next, RFK makes the claim that nearly 2/3 of children with autism spectrum disorder in the latest survey had either severe or borderline intellectual disability. There is no diagnostic criteria that would notate borderline intellectual disability. There are two possible autism diagnoses: with accompanying intellectual disability and without accompanying intellectual disability. Of those who do have an intellectual disability, there is no diagnostic marker for severe or mild. He goes on to draw attention to, quote, stark disparities across racial and ethnic groups. And yes, CDC data does support that for the first time in history, Black and Hispanic children are being diagnosed at higher rates than white children. But again, I don't know how many more ways to say this is because we know so much more about autism now, and we're diagnosing children who would have historically slipped through the cracks. Minorities have been historically underserved in terms of autism diagnoses and care. Research attributes that to hesitation from parents to bring up autistic traits in children, and rightfully so when you consider existing medical biases, and medical biases against parents of color, and high rates of misdiagnosis, especially for Black children. We know why these children weren't getting diagnosed in the past. We're surely and slowly correcting those missteps, which is why those children are getting diagnosed now. In regards to the claim that those children are more likely to have a more severe form of autism, which, by the way, is not the correct terminology, it's not a far stretch to believe that we're still underdiagnosing low support needs children because of reasons we've already gone over. This next point was not included in the official memo, but was part of his very offensive and troubling press conference on April 16th, which is that, quote, these children are perfectly healthy and then they turn to and regress into autism. I'm assuming that he chose the age of 2 years old because by 2, children have just completed their initial childhood vaccinations. This is where the entire anti-vax argument really got its start. Children typically finish receiving their vaccines at 2. Currently, research says that an autism diagnosis is reliable beginning at age 2. These two facts are unrelated to one another. An autism diagnosis requires parents and doctors to notice missed milestones, especially as they relate to communication skills. One of the most notable milestones is a speech delay. Those delays, while they may occur earlier in life, will be noticeable by age 2. You can technically diagnose a child earlier than that based on things like atypical reactions to their environment or not responding to cues from their parents and caregivers. However, by 2, a speech delay would start to become apparent. When coupled with other potential noticeable delays, then a doctor can reasonably diagnose a child with autism. As of now, 2 is considered the earliest age for an accurate diagnosis. So it's not that all of these 1 in 33 children became autistic on the eve of their 2nd birthday. It's that largely until a child is 2, there's not enough evidence to reliably diagnose that child with autism. Correlation is not causation. I think that covers most, if not all, of the misinformation in RFK's problematic and moronic outings this week. Of course, during his speech, he also boldly asserted that autistic children will never pay taxes, hold down a job, go on a date, play baseball, or write a poem. I would sit here and debunk this for you, and it would be really easy to do. However, doing that will only further this vile idea that the administration is pushing, that one must do these things in order to be considered a human instead of a burden. So instead of providing you with any number of the hundreds of thousands of stories of autistic people meeting these arbitrary benchmarks, I'll just ask you to consider how comfortable you are with a eugenicist rhetoric, because that is what that is. To talk about what's going on with autism today, we really need to go back to the beginning, all the way back to Germany in the 1930s. See, I told you we would get to eugenics. As for this section, I would really encourage you to read Neurotribes by Steve Silberman because it will go into depth about the history of autism in a way that I really can't in a one-off video. I'd also like to recommend Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna by Dr. Edith Schaefer if you're curious about specifically the tie between autism, Nazis, and eugenics. Anyway, back to Germany in the 30s and 40s. Before we dive into any stats, I want to make it clear that the first victims of the Holocaust were autistic and disabled children. Years before Nazis were taking people to concentration camps, they were exterminating disabled children in special children's wards because they claimed that the German society had no room for anyone different. In fact, the reasons Asperger's syndrome even existed as a diagnosis in the first place is because the Nazis needed a label for autistic children who could be reasonably expected to be economically productive. And that distinction saved some lives. Not all of them, but some. This distinction worked in some capacity because when the Nazis began to dehumanize autistic children, they did so by publishing political cartoons about how expensive it is to educate and support them as opposed to their non-disabled peers. And of course, before you can exterminate a group from existence, you have to first convince the onlookers that they were subhuman to begin with. So at this point, with the Nazism of it all fresh in your mind, I'll invite you to remember the whole "these children will never write a poem" thing from earlier, and I'll invite you to listen closely to this. RFK began his speech and ended his written memo with a frightening sentiment. These children will never pay taxes, and the costs of this crisis are threatening to our country. This is a full mask off moment. This is the bottom line. When RFK is telling you that this epidemic is robbing us of our greatest resource, he's not telling you that he cares about children feeling joy or living happy lives. He's telling you that because these children might not participate in the workforce in a way that he deems meaningful, it is a threat to our very way of life. This is not about easing the burden of being a caretaker of a high-needs autistic child or making the world more accommodating to the 2% of us that are autistic. He's telling you that we are drains on society and that is the real problem to be solved. I need you to sit with that knowledge for a second and see if you can piece together why RFK's rhetoric is so dangerous. It's because, like autism, it's not new. We've heard all of this before. RFK is not just borrowing, but completely plagiarizing Nazi rhetoric when he speaks about autistic children. He's working methodically to convince the masses that by virtue of not being athletically inclined or by not paying taxes, they are unequivocally less human than you. He is cloaking it in faux concern and hiding behind debunked conspiracy theories and junk science, and it is working. Now that we've talked about facts and science and history and all of that good stuff, let me just appeal to your humanity for a second. I want you to look at me. Really, just look at me. A human person with thoughts and dreams and friends and pets and a whole life, and tell me that I'm a problem to be solved. Tell me that because of my neurotype, I'm less deserving of life and liberty than you are. Tell me that the millions of people like me are actually, quote, a threat to the American people and our way of life. Tell me that I'm a catastrophe for this country. If you believe that genuinely, I invite you to call me directly. I would really like the distinct honor of hearing you say it to my face. Anyway, if you listen to this, thank you. I don't really know what this is or if it will do any good, but I just feel like I had to do something. So yeah, thank you for listening. Send it to someone if you feel like it. Okay, bye.